The stars looked different when you knew someone wanted to kill you. And General Lee Taman had learned this truth 3 weeks ago when the first Galactic Council ships appeared at the edge of human space, and their message was simple and clear, which was surrender or face total destruction. And now he stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching those same alien vessels maintain their positions like hungry predators, waiting for the right moment to strike, and his wife, Dr. Kim Nari, was somewhere out there on the neutral world of Kepler Station, attending what she believed was a peaceful scientific conference about interspecies medical research. But Taman knew better, because nothing the Council did was ever about peace. The communication array crackled to life, and Admiral Park Jin-ho's weathered face appeared on the main screen, and his expression was grim as he spoke from his command ship 3 light years away. And he said, "The Council has made contact again, and this time they want to talk to all 3 of us together." And Taman nodded, because he had been expecting this moment for days now. And within minutes the third face appeared on screen, belonging to General Choi Woo-bin, whose intelligence networks stretched across half the galaxy, and whose wife Han Mira was also attending conferences on different worlds, and all 3 men knew without speaking that their families were in danger. The Council's representative materialized as a hologram in the center of their shared communication, and it was a Velkari, which was one of the oldest and most arrogant species in the galaxy, and its skin was pale blue like ice, and its eyes were completely black, and it spoke in the universal trade language, but with a tone that suggested it was talking to children who had misbehaved, and it said, "Humanity has grown too bold and too fast, and your expansion across 47 worlds threatens the natural order that has existed for thousands of years, and now you must choose between wisdom and destruction." President Kang Do-yun joined the communication from Earth, and his face was calm, but Taman could see the steel in his eyes, and the president said, "We have violated no laws and threatened no one in our colonies, are peaceful and productive, and we seek only to build better lives for our people." And the Velkari representative made a sound that might have been laughter but held no warmth, and it said, "Your very existence threatens us, because you reproduce too quickly and adapt too easily, and your technology advances at a rate that disturbs the balance of power that has maintained peace for millennia." Taman felt his hands clench into fists, because the truth was becoming clear, and the Council was not interested in peace or balance but in maintaining their position as the dominant force in the galaxy, and humanity had committed the crime of being successful without asking permission. And Park Jin-ho leaned forward and asked, "What exactly are you demanding?" And the alien's response was delivered without emotion, and it said, "Humanity will abandon all colonies beyond your birth system and submit to Council oversight, and you will limit your population growth and cease all military development. And in return, we will allow your species to continue existing." The silence that followed was deafening, and Taman could see the rage building in his fellow commanders' faces, because what the Council was demanding was not peace, but slavery. And they wanted humanity to give up everything they had built and accept permanent subjugation. And President Kang spoke slowly and clearly, and said, "We reject your demands completely." And the Velkari tilted its head as if considering this response and said, "Then you have chosen poorly, and there will be consequences for your arrogance." General Choi Woo-bin activated his personal scanner, and his face went pale as he read the results. And he said, "My intelligence networks are detecting Council ships moving toward the neutral worlds where our families are stationed." And Taman felt ice form in his stomach, because his wife was brilliant and kind, and had dedicated her life to helping others through medical research, and the thought of her in danger made him want to tear the alien apart with his bare hands. But he forced himself to remain calm, and asked, "What are your intentions regarding the civilians on those worlds?" The Velkari's expression never changed, but somehow it managed to convey satisfaction, and it said, "Your families will be safe if you agree to our terms immediately and unconditionally. But if you continue to resist, then they will face the consequences of your poor choices." And Park Jin-ho stood up so quickly, his chair fell backward, and he shouted, "You threaten innocent people and call it diplomacy." And the alien remained unmoved and said, "We threaten no one, but we cannot guarantee the safety of those who associate with criminals and enemies of galactic peace." Taman's wife had sent him a message just that morning talking about her excitement over a breakthrough in treating a rare alien disease, and how the research could help millions of beings across different species. And she had no idea that her work and her life had become pawns in a political game, and the general forced himself to think clearly because anger would not save her, and only careful planning and decisive action could protect the people he loved. And he looked at his fellow commanders and saw the same calculation in their eyes. The council representative continued speaking and said, "You have one standard galactic day to provide your answer, and during this time, your families will remain under our protection on the neutral worlds. And we suggest you use this time wisely to consider the fate of your entire species." And then the hologram vanished, leaving the three generals and the president staring at empty space and the weight of an impossible choice. And Taman immediately began reviewing tactical reports because surrender was not an option, but neither was allowing innocent people to die. President Kang rubbed his temples and said, "Our intelligence suggests the council has been planning this for months, and they have positioned ships near every major human colony, and their demands are designed to cripple us permanently." And Park Jin-ho nodded grimly and said they want us to become a client species, like the others they have conquered, and Choi Woo-bin was already pulling up files on his personal display and said, "My sources indicate this is not just about stopping our expansion, but about making an example of us to prevent other young species from challenging their authority." The president looked at each of them and said, "I need your honest assessment of our military capabilities against a full council fleet." And Taman had been preparing for this question and said, "Our ships are more advanced than theirs individually, but they have numerical superiority and the advantage of choosing when and where to fight." And Park Jin-ho added that our ground forces are highly trained and motivated, but we cannot defend 47 worlds simultaneously against concentrated attacks. And Choi Woo-bin said, "Our intelligence networks could cause significant disruption, but not enough to prevent massive casualties." The reality was stark and clear, and humanity faced an enemy with superior numbers and strategic positioning, and the council had chosen their timing perfectly. By threatening the families of the military leadership and forcing impossible choices between duty and love. And Taman thought about his wife's laugh, and the way she hummed while working in her laboratory, and how she always smelled like the lavender soap she imported from Earth, and the idea of never seeing her again made him feel hollow inside. But he also knew that surrendering would doom billions of humans to a life of servitude. General Park Jin-ho broke the silence and said, "Even if we agree to their terms, they will never trust us, and eventually they will decide that humanity is too dangerous to exist, and they will find excuses to eliminate us piece by piece." And President Kang nodded slowly because they all understood that the council's offer was not really about peace but about buying time to prepare for humanity's complete destruction. And the only question was whether that destruction would come quickly through war or slowly through systematic oppression. Choi Woo-bin received an encrypted message and his face went white as he read it, and he said, "My intelligence assets report that council ships have surrounded the stations where our families are located, and they are preparing for some kind of public broadcast, and the transmission arrays on those worlds are being activated for galaxy-wide distribution." And Taman felt his heart stop because he suddenly understood what the council was planning, and it was worse than threats or demands, because they intended to make an example that would be remembered across the galaxy for generations. The president asked what kind of broadcast, and Woo-bin's voice was barely above a whisper as he said, "The kind that shows what happens to those who defy the Galactic Council." The broadcast began at exactly noon Galactic Standard Time, and every human settlement from the outer colonies to Earth received the signal simultaneously, and General Lee Taman stood frozen on his bridge watching the main screen as his wife, Dr. Kim Nari, appeared in chains on what looked like a public execution platform on Kepler Station, and she was flanked by two other women he recognized as Song Yumi, the diplomat who was married to General Park Jin-ho, and Han Mira, the war correspondent, who had married General Choi Woo-bin, and all three women stood with their heads high despite their circumstances, while alien guards surrounded them with weapons drawn. The Velkari representative from their earlier conversation stepped forward and addressed the camera with the same emotionless tone he had used during negotiations, and he said, "Citizens of the galaxy, you are about to witness the fate of those who support criminals and terrorists, and these three females have chosen to associate with enemies of galactic peace, and their deaths will serve as a lesson to all who would challenge the natural order. And Taman felt his hands shake as he realized this was not a threat or negotiation, but an actual execution being broadcast across billions of worlds to terrorize humanity into submission. Dr. Kim Nari was brought forward first, and the executioner was a massive creature from a species Taman did not recognize, with 4 arms and skin like dark metal, and it held a weapon that hummed with energy while Nari stood perfectly still and looked directly into the camera, and she began to speak in a clear, steady voice and said, "My name is Dr. Kim Nari, and I have dedicated my life to healing and helping others regardless of their species, and I do not regret this choice." And she paused, and her eyes seemed to look directly at her husband through the screen and said, "The research data you need is hidden in medical file 77 alpha on my personal computer, and the protein sequence for the Velkari genetic marker is incomplete in their databases, and that is their weakness." The executioner raised its weapon, and Nari continued, speaking faster now, and said, "I love you, Taman, and I believe in what we are building together as a species, and do not let my death be meaningless, and use what I have discovered to protect our people." And the energy beam struck her, and she fell forward, and Taman screamed her name, but the sound was lost in the chaos of his bridge crew shouting and cursing while he stood paralyzed, watching the love of his life die for the crime of being married to him and believing in humanity's right to exist freely among the stars. Song Yumi was next, and she walked to the execution spot without being dragged, and she looked into the camera with the same diplomatic poise that had made her famous across human space, and she said, "I am Song Yumi, and I have worked my entire career to build bridges between species and find peaceful solutions to conflicts, and my death today proves that some beings prefer violence to understanding." And she looked directly at the Velkari representative and said, "You think you are strong, but you are afraid, and fear makes you cruel, and cruelty makes you weak, and you will discover this truth soon enough." The diplomat turned back to the camera and said to my husband Jinho, and to all the soldiers who protect our worlds, "Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. And we did not come to the stars to bow down to tyrants, but to build something better than what came before." And she smiled and said, "I am proud to be human, and proud to die as one." And the second executioner fired, and she collapsed, and General Park Jinho made a sound like a wounded animal while his command crew stood in stunned silence around him, and the galaxy watched another innocent person die for the Council's political theater. Han Mira was the last to face execution, and she was a journalist who had covered wars and disasters across human space, and she had seen death before but never her own, and she stood before the camera and said, "I am Han Mira, and I have spent my life reporting the truth, even when it was dangerous or unpopular, and the truth about today is that the Galactic Council is murdering innocent women to terrorize their husbands into submission." And she gestured toward the alien guards and said, "These beings call themselves civilized, but they are cowards who hide behind superior numbers and threaten families instead of fighting soldiers." The correspondent pulled a small device from her clothing before the guards could stop her, and she activated it and said, "This transmitter is broadcasting the exact coordinates of 7 Council weapons facilities that my intelligence sources have identified, and the data is being sent to human military networks right now." And she looked at her husband through the screen and said, "Wubin, use this information to hurt them where it matters, and remember that love is not weakness but the source of our greatest strength." And the third executioner fired, and she fell, and General Choi Wubin slammed his fist into his command console hard enough to crack the metal while tears streamed down his face. The Velkari representative stepped forward again and said, "This is the fate of all who oppose the Council, and humanity must now choose between surrender and watching more of their loved ones die, and we will allow one standard day for your answer, and then we will begin executing the families of your planetary governors, and then your ship captains, and then anyone else who supports your illegal rebellion against galactic authority." And the broadcast ended, leaving billions of humans staring at blank screens and processing what they had just witnessed. General Taman stood motionless for several minutes while his bridge crew waited for orders, and he was remembering his wife's last morning on Earth when she had made breakfast and talked excitedly about her research and how she believed her work could help prevent a plague that was spreading through several alien worlds. And she had kissed him goodbye and said she would be back in 2 weeks with data that could save millions of lives, and now she was dead because she had married a man who refused to kneel to tyrants. The communication system activated, and President Kang Do-yun appeared on screen, and his face was pale but determined. And he said, to all 3 generals, I know what you have lost today, and I know the pain you are feeling, but I need to know if you can still command, because our entire species depends on your decisions in the next few hours. And Taemin looked at his fellow commanders and saw the same cold rage in their eyes that was building in his own chest, and he said, we can command, Mr. President, and we will make them pay for what they have done. Park Jin-ho wiped the tears from his face and said, my wife died telling us to be courageous, and I will not dishonor her memory by cowering before murderers. And Choi Woo-bin nodded and said, Mira gave us intelligence that could cripple their weapons programs, and we would be fools not to use it. And President Kang said, then, you are all prepared to fight, even knowing the odds against us, and all 3 generals answered yes simultaneously, because there was no other choice that allowed them to remain human. The president closed his eyes for a moment and said, the council expects us to surrender now that they have proven their willingness to kill innocents, but they have made a fundamental error in their understanding of our species. And Taemin asked what error, and Kang replied they think love makes us weak, but they are wrong, because love makes us strong enough to do impossible things and determined enough to never give up. And today they did not break us, but united us in a way that has never happened before. In human history, reports began flooding in from across human space, and every colony, every ship, every station had received the broadcast, and the reaction was not panic or calls for surrender, but something the council had not anticipated, and communication networks were overwhelmed with messages of solidarity and offers of support, and civilian populations were volunteering for military service, and industrial facilities were converting to weapons production without being asked. And the entire species was mobilizing for war with a speed and coordination that surprised even their own leaders. General Choi Woo-bin reviewed the intelligence data his wife had transmitted before her death, and said she was right about the weapons facilities, and my sources confirm these locations house their primary manufacturing and research centers, and if we could destroy even half of them, it would cripple their ability to sustain a long campaign. And Taemin was studying his wife's medical research, and said the genetic data she mentioned could be developed into biological weapons that target specific alien species while leaving humans unharmed. And Park Jin-ho said my wife talked about courage, and I think she meant we should stop being afraid of what they might do and start making them afraid of what we will do. The 3 generals spent the next hour coordinating their response, and they divided responsibilities based on their specialties and expertise, and Taemin would focus on developing new weapons based on his wife's research, and Park Jin-ho would prepare the ground forces for a different kind of warfare than they had ever fought before, and Choi Woo-bin would use his intelligence networks to turn the council's member species against each other and create chaos within. Their alliance president Kang addressed the entire human population in a broadcast that was transmitted to every world and station and ship, and he said, today, we witnessed an act of barbarism that reveals the true nature of those who claim to represent galactic civilization, and our response will not be surrender or negotiation, but something our enemies will never. The silence began exactly 24 hours after the execution broadcast, when every human settlement across 47 worlds stopped all external communication simultaneously, and General Lee Taemin stood in his laboratory working with equipment he had never imagined using for warfare, while his wife's research files glowed on multiple screens around him, and her notes about alien genetic markers had become the foundation for weapons that could target specific species without harming humans. And the irony was not lost on him that her work to heal had become his tool for revenge. Dr. Lee Sun-ho joined Taemin in the laboratory, and he was humanity's greatest geneticist and had worked with Dr. Kim Nari on several research projects, and he said, I have been analyzing her data about the Velkari protein sequences, and she was correct about their genetic weakness, and their immune systems cannot process certain synthetic compounds that are harmless to other species, and we can create a virus that will target only them while leaving their client species unharmed, and this could fracture their alliance by showing that humans can strike precisely instead of causing collateral damage. Meanwhile, General Park Jin-ho was transforming. his colonial marines in ways that would have seemed impossible before the executions, and his soldiers were learning new tactics based on guerrilla warfare and infiltration rather than traditional fleet battles. And he was studying reports from his wife's diplomatic missions and realized that many council member species were held in line by fear rather than loyalty. And if that fear could be redirected toward the council itself, then their entire power structure would collapse from within. Lieutenant Kim Dae-ho approached General Park and said, "Sir, our intelligence indicates that the council expects us to attack their main fleets in direct confrontation, and their defensive positions are strongest around their core worlds and primary shipyards. But they have left their outer colonies relatively undefended because they assume we will focus on military targets." And Park smiled grimly and said, "Then we will do exactly what they do not expect, and we will make them afraid for their civilians, just as they made us fear for ours." General Choi Woo-bin was coordinating the most complex intelligence operation in human history, and his networks had identified key figures in each council member species who were dissatisfied with Velkari dominance, and he was using information provided by his deceased wife to contact resistance movements that most humans did not even know existed. And the goal was not just to defeat the council militarily, but to destroy their political unity and replace their authoritarian system with something that could never again threaten peaceful species. Agent Song Minji reported to General Choi from deep within council territory, and she said the execution broadcast had an unexpected effect on several member species, and many of their leaders are questioning whether the council's methods are justified, and there is growing concern that if they can murder innocent civilians for political purposes, then no one is truly safe under their rule, and this fear is creating opportunities for us to recruit allies from within their own system. President Kang Do-yoon addressed the three generals in a secure communication and said, "Our silence has made the council nervous because they expected either surrender or immediate retaliation, and instead they are facing something they do not understand. And their intelligence services are struggling to predict our next move because we are not following any of their strategic models, and this uncertainty is our greatest weapon right now." The president continued and said, "I have authorized the activation of Project Silent Thunder, which was our contingency plan for total war, and every human colony is now operating under emergency protocols, and civilian populations have been moved to secure locations while industrial facilities convert to military production. And we are implementing technologies that we have kept secret for exactly this situation. And the council is about to discover that they have been fighting an enemy they never truly understood." General Taemin completed the first batch of targeted biological weapons based on his wife's research, and the testing results exceeded all expectations, and the virus could be deployed through atmospheric processors on council worlds and would affect only Velkari physiology, while leaving other species completely unharmed. And he said this weapon honors Nari's dedication to precision medicine, because it will heal the galaxy by removing the disease of tyranny, while protecting innocent populations from collateral damage. Dr. Lee Sun-ho worked alongside Taemin to refine the delivery system and said we can modify standard atmospheric maintenance drones to carry the virus, and they will appear to be routine equipment maintenance while actually delivering the payload to every major population center simultaneously. And the council will not realize what is happening until it is too late to develop countermeasures, and their entire leadership structure will collapse within days. General Park Jin-ho launched the first phase of his campaign against council outer colonies, and his forces used stolen ships and forged identification codes to approach their targets as friendly vessels, and the attacks came from within their own security perimeters and caused massive damage to infrastructure, while carefully avoiding civilian casualties. And the message was clear that humanity could strike anywhere at any time with surgical precision. The Battle of Rigel Station demonstrated the new human approach to warfare, and a team of 50 colonial marines infiltrated the facility disguised as maintenance workers, and they disabled the station's defenses from within, while a human fleet approached openly and demanded surrender. And the council forces found themselves trapped between internal sabotage and external pressure, and they capitulated without firing a shot. And 8,000 alien personnel became prisoners who were treated according to human standards of dignity and respect. General Choi Woo-bin received reports from his intelligence networks across council space, and the effects of his psychological warfare campaign were exceeding all projections, and 3 member species had recalled their fleets from human territory to defend their homeworlds against rumored human infiltration, and 2 others were demanding that the Velkari explain how they plan to protect civilian populations from human retaliation, and the Council's unity was fracturing as each species began prioritizing their own survival over collective action. Agent Park Soo-young transmitted from the Council's capital world and said the Velkari leadership is panicking because they cannot locate human forces or predict their next target, and their intelligence services are reporting contradictory information. And some of their military commanders are questioning whether they should continue offensive operations or focus on defense, and this confusion is spreading throughout their command structure and making coordinated responses nearly impossible. The second phase of human operations began with simultaneous strikes against 7 Council weapons facilities using the coordinates provided by Hanmira before her execution, and the attacks were carried out by teams that had been positioned weeks in advance, and each facility was destroyed completely, while the surrounding areas remained untouched, and the message was that humanity remembered every word of their wives' final transmissions and would honor their sacrifice with precise and devastating action. General Taman deployed his biological weapon against 3 Velkari worlds, and the atmospheric processors delivered the virus exactly as designed, and within 72 hours, the entire Velkari leadership hierarchy was either dead or dying, while other species on the same worlds remained completely healthy, and the psychological impact was enormous because it demonstrated that humans could eliminate their enemies with godlike precision while protecting everyone else. The Velkari Emperor appeared in a desperate broadcast to all Council worlds and said humanity possesses weapons beyond our understanding, and they are using our own people against us, and our allies are abandoning us, and he demanded that all member species commit their full military resources to destroying humanity before they could be targeted individually, and his panic was obvious, and several species immediately refused his orders and began withdrawing from the conflict. General Park Jinho received intelligence that the Council was planning to execute more human civilians in retaliation for their losses, and he immediately deployed rapid response teams to 17 different locations where humans were being held, and the rescues were conducted simultaneously with such speed and precision that Council forces had no time to react, and every human hostage was recovered alive, while their captors were eliminated without mercy or hesitation. The galaxy watched in amazement as humanity demonstrated capabilities that seemed impossible for such a young species, and they were fighting a war unlike anything in recorded history, where every strike was calculated to minimize innocent casualties while maximizing psychological impact. And their enemies were discovering that humans could be more terrifying in their precision than other species were in their brutality. President Kang received a communication from the Emperor of the Zephyrian Republic, which was one of the Council's most powerful member species. And he said, "We wish to negotiate a separate peace with humanity and withdraw our forces from this conflict, and we were coerced into joining the Council's action against you, and we have no desire to." The Battle of Vorthak Prime began 3 months after the executions, when General Park Jinho's colonial marines emerged from the planet's molten core using equipment that should not have existed, and the Velkari capital world had been considered impregnable because it was surrounded by defensive stations and protected by the largest fleet in Council space. But nobody had expected an attack to come from beneath their feet, and the Marines had spent weeks tunneling through the planet's crust, using mining equipment modified with human technology that could bore through solid rock as easily as cutting through paper. Colonel Lee Ji-hoon led the assault force through the underground passages they had carved, and his soldiers moved with the precision that came from months of training in similar conditions, and they wore environmental suits that protected them from the intense heat, while their weapons were designed specifically for close quarters combat in confined spaces. And when they reached the surface beneath the capital city, they found themselves exactly where General Park had calculated they would be, which was directly under the Velkari Imperial Palace. The Velkari defenders were caught completely off guard when human soldiers began emerging from manholes and service tunnels throughout their most secure district, and the Marines had studied the city's infrastructure for weeks and knew every pipe and conduit and access point, and they moved through the urban environment like ghosts, while Velkari security forces struggled to understand how enemies had appeared inside their innermost defensive perimeter. General Park Jin-ho coordinated the surface assault from his command ship, and he watched his wife's principles guide every tactical decision. Because Song Yumi had believed in protecting innocents even during warfare, and the Marines were using non-lethal weapons against civilian populations, while employing devastating force against military targets, and the contrast sent a clear message about human values and the difference between justified resistance and indiscriminate violence. The Velkari Emperor tried to escape in his personal transport, but found the launch bays blocked by human soldiers who had been waiting for exactly this attempt, and Colonel Lee Ji-hoon approached the alien leader and said in perfect Velkari, "You are under arrest for war crimes and the murder of innocent civilians, and you will face trial before representatives of all the species you have oppressed." And the Emperor demanded to know how humans had achieved the impossible by penetrating his world's defenses. And Ji-hoon replied that love makes humans capable of anything, including burrowing through the heart of a planet to reach their enemies. Meanwhile, General Lee Taemin was orchestrating Operation Silent Thunder from his laboratory aboard the flagship where his wife had once worked, and the biological weapons based on Dr. Kim Nari's research were being deployed across 17 Council worlds simultaneously, and the delivery systems were so sophisticated that they appeared to be routine medical supply drops and atmospheric maintenance operations. And by the time Council authorities realized what was happening, their leadership hierarchies were already collapsing from within. Dr. Lee Sun-ho monitored the biological weapons deployment and said, "The targeting is perfect, and we are seeing complete effectiveness against hostile leadership, while civilian populations remain unharmed. And several species are experiencing what appears to be spontaneous regime change as their oppressive rulers die, and more moderate leaders assume control. And this is exactly what Dr. Kim Nari would have wanted, which is healing through the precise removal of diseased elements." The siege of the Nexus began when General Lee Taemin's fleet surrounded the Council's central command station and used technology that had never been seen before to create an impenetrable barrier around the facility, and the station's occupants found themselves cut off from all communication with the outside galaxy, and their supply lines severed, and their escape routes blocked, and they were forced to watch helplessly as their empire crumbled around them while they remained trapped in their supposedly impregnable fortress. Captain Song Ji-won commanded the lead ship in Taemin's fleet, and she reported that the Nexus station was requesting negotiations, and General Taemin responded that there would be no negotiations with murderers and war criminals, and the only acceptable outcome was complete surrender and submission to human justice. And the station's commanders were informed that they had one standard hour to decide whether they wanted to surrender peacefully or be taken by force. General Choi Woo-bin implemented the final phase of his intelligence warfare campaign, and resistance movements across the galaxy began coordinated uprisings against Council authority, and the timing was perfect because Council military forces were scattered and demoralized, and their communication networks were compromised, and their leadership was either dead or dying from human biological weapons, and the rebellions succeeded with minimal casualties because the oppressed populations had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Agent Kim Min-sok reported from the former Council world of Kepler Station, where the executions had taken place, and said the local population has overthrown their Council-appointed governor and established a democratic government, and they are requesting human assistance in rebuilding their society without oppression, and they have erected a memorial to Dr. Kim Nari Song Yumi and Han Mira, and declared them heroes of galactic liberation. The Battle of Zirion demonstrated how completely human tactics had evolved since the war began, and a single company of colonial Marines defeated an entire Council garrison, not through superior firepower, but through psychological warfare, and the Marines surrounded the garrison and broadcast recordings of the original execution, along with footage of what had happened to every other Council force that had fought against humanity, and the garrison surrendered without firing a shot. Because their morale had completely collapsed, General Park Jin-ho received reports from across the battlefront, and every engagement was following the same pattern, where Council forces were either surrendering immediately or being defeated with minimal human casualties, and he realized that his wife's diplomatic philosophy had been correct, and that showing restraint and protecting innocence while demonstrating overwhelming capability against aggressors was more effective than simple brutality. President Kang Do-hyun addressed the three generals in a secure communication and said the council is collapsing faster than our most optimistic projections predicted, and 16 member species have withdrawn from the alliance and declared neutrality, and 7 others are actively supporting our operations against the remaining council loyalists, and we are achieving victory through a combination of precision, military action, and political warfare that honors the memory of your wives. The Velkari homeworld fell when General Taemin's biological weapons eliminated 90% of their government officials and military commanders within 72 hours, and the surviving population immediately surrendered and requested human protection from reprisals by other species who had been oppressed by Velkari rule for centuries, and Taemin granted their request because his wife's research had been intended to heal, not to commit genocide, and humanity would not become the monster they had fought against. General Choi Woo-bin coordinated the capture of Council intelligence facilities across 12 worlds, and the information recovered revealed the true extent of their crimes, including detailed records of species that had been eliminated for opposing Council authority, and evidence of systematic oppression and exploitation that had lasted for thousands of years, and the documentation would be crucial for the war crimes trials that would follow. The final battle of the war occurred not in space but in a courtroom when the surviving council leadership was brought before a tribunal composed of representatives from every species in the galaxy, and the proceedings were broadcast across all worlds so that everyone could witness justice being served. And the evidence presented included recordings of the execution of the 3 human women, along with thousands of other atrocities committed by council forces. General Lee Taemin testified about his wife's dedication to helping others, and how her murder had been intended to terrorize humanity into submission, and he presented the biological weapons that had been developed from her research and explained how they had been designed to target only those who supported oppression while protecting innocent civilians, and he said that every precision strike had honored her memory by healing the galaxy through the removal of its diseased leadership. General Park Jin-ho spoke about his wife's diplomatic work and how she had spent her career building bridges between species and seeking peaceful solutions to conflicts, and he described how her final words about courage had inspired the tactics that minimized casualties, while maximizing psychological impact, and he said that every successful negotiation and every enemy surrender had proven her belief that strength, combined with restraint, was more powerful than simple violence. General Choi Woo-bin presented intelligence, evidence showing the scope of council crimes, and he spoke about his wife's journalistic integrity and her commitment to revealing truth even when it was dangerous, and he said that every piece of evidence recovered and every resistance movement supported had honored her legacy by ensuring that the galaxy would know the full extent of what they had endured under council rule. 6 months after the execution broadcast that had changed the galaxy forever, President Kang Do-hyun stood before the first assembly of the Galactic Democratic Federation, and behind him were the 3 generals who had transformed personal tragedy into galactic liberation, and the hall contained representatives from over 300 species, including many who had been oppressed under council rule for generations, and the atmosphere was one of hope, mixed with the solemn recognition of what had been sacrificed to achieve this moment. General Lee Taemin had been promoted to Director of Galactic Health Services, and he oversaw the distribution of medical technologies based on his wife's research to worlds that had been denied proper healthcare under council authority, and Dr. Kim Nari's work was saving millions of lives across species boundaries exactly as she had always hoped, and her precision medicine techniques were being used to heal rather than harm, and Taemin found peace in knowing that her legacy was one of compassion rather than the weapons that had been necessary to end the war. The Nari Medical Research Station orbited the world where she had been executed, and it was staffed by scientists from dozens of species, who worked together to develop treatments for diseases that affected multiple populations, and Taemin visited the station regularly, and he could almost hear his wife's laughter echoing through the corridors where researchers continued her work. With the same dedication to helping others regardless of their origin, General Park Jin-ho had become the first director of galactic security, and his role was to ensure that no species could ever again accumulate enough power to threaten others, and the colonial marines had evolved into a peacekeeping force that intervened in conflicts before they could escalate to violence, and every operation followed the principles that Song Yumi had articulated in her final speech, which emphasized courage combined with restraint and protection of innocence above all other considerations. The Yumi Diplomatic Academy trained negotiators from across the galaxy in techniques that prioritized understanding over dominance and compromise over conquest. And Park often lectured at the academy about his wife's belief that most conflicts arose from fear and misunderstanding rather than genuine incompatibility. And students learned to identify the root causes of disputes and address them before they could lead to violence. General Choi Woo-bin directed the new Galactic Intelligence Coordination Bureau, which was tasked with preventing the rise of authoritarian movements and ensuring that information flowed freely between democratic governments, and his networks had been transformed from instruments of war into guardians of transparency and accountability. And every report honored his wife's journalistic commitment to truth by exposing corruption and oppression wherever it might emerge. The Mira Center for Democratic Education worked to ensure that young beings across the galaxy learned about the importance of freedom and the dangers of concentrated power, and Han Mira's final broadcast was studied as an example of how individual courage could inspire collective action, and her words about truth being more powerful than tyranny had become a rallying cry for democratic movements throughout the galaxy. President Kang addressed the assembly and said, "We gather today not to celebrate victory in war, but to commit ourselves to building a peace that honors those who died to make it possible." And the 3 women whose murders sparked this transformation did not die for revenge, but for the principle that no being should live in fear of their government and no species should bow down to tyrants simply because they possess superior firepower. The president continued and said the council ruled through fear and maintained order through the threat of violence against innocence, and they believed that love and compassion were weaknesses that could be exploited, and they discovered too late that these qualities are actually the source of our greatest strength, because beings who fight for those they love are capable of achieving the impossible. Dr. Lee Sun-ho had established research facilities on 17 worlds where scientists worked to develop technologies that could benefit all species, and the biological weapons that had ended the war were being converted into medical treatments that targeted diseases rather than specific genetic markers. And the same precision that had eliminated oppressive leaders was now being used to eliminate suffering and illness across the galaxy, Captain Song Ji-won commanded. The first integrated crew in galactic history with representatives from 43 species working together aboard a single vessel, and their mission was exploration rather than conquest. And they traveled to uncharted regions seeking new worlds and new forms of life, and their ship was named the Nari Yumi Mira, in honor of the women whose sacrifice had made such cooperation possible. The former council worlds were rebuilding under democratic governments, and many species were experiencing freedom for the first time in centuries, and the transition was not without difficulties. But human advisors worked alongside local leaders to establish institutions that protected individual rights while respecting cultural differences, and the goal was not to create human colonies but to help each species develop its own path to democracy. Agent Kim Min-sok had retired from intelligence work and become a teacher at the Mira Center, where he helped young beings understand the importance of questioning authority and thinking independently. And he often told his students that freedom was not a gift that could be given, but a responsibility that each generation must earn and protect through constant vigilance and active participation in democratic processes. The memorial to Dr. Kim Nari Song Yumi and Han Mira was located on the neutral world where they had died, and it consisted of 3 pillars representing healing diplomacy and truth, with water flowing between them to symbolize the connections that bind all intelligent life, and visitors came from across the galaxy to pay their respects and to remember that progress often requires sacrifice, but that such sacrifice should never be forgotten or taken for granted. General Taman often visited the memorial, and he would sit quietly beside his wife's pillar and tell her about the lives that were being saved by her research and the diseases that were being conquered using her techniques. And he would promise that her work would continue, and that her dedication to helping others would inspire future generations of healers and researchers. General Park would stand before his wife's pillar and speak about the conflicts that had been resolved through negotiation rather than warfare, and the young diplomats who were learning to build bridges instead of walls. And he would tell Song Yumi that her belief in the power of understanding was spreading across the galaxy, and that fewer beings were dying in senseless. War's General Choi would visit his wife's memorial and report on the corrupt officials who had been exposed, and the democratic movements that were flourishing, and the free press that was holding governments accountable. And he would tell Han Mira that truth was winning against propaganda, and that her example was inspiring journalists to risk their lives for the sake of exposing injustice. The Galactic Democratic Federation faced many challenges in its early years, including economic disputes and cultural conflicts and the lingering resentment of species who had benefited from council authority. But the principles established by the three women continued to guide policy decisions, and whenever representatives were tempted to choose expediency over ethics, they remembered the price that had been paid for their freedom. President Kang delivered his final address as the first leader of the Federation and said, "We have built something unprecedented in galactic history, which is a government based on consent rather than conquest and cooperation rather than coercion. And the foundation of our success is the understanding that strength comes not from the ability to destroy our enemies, but from the wisdom to transform them into allies." The president looked at the three generals and said, "These men lost the most precious things in their lives, but they chose to honor their wives' memories by creating something better than what existed before, and they could have chosen revenge, but instead they chose justice, and they could have chosen dominance, but instead they chose partnership, and they have shown us that love is indeed the most powerful force in the universe." As the assembly concluded, representatives from hundreds of worlds rose in silent tribute to Dr. Kim Nari Song Yumi and Han Mira, and their sacrifice had transformed personal tragedy into galactic triumph, and their deaths had not been meaningless, but had become the foundation for a new age of freedom and cooperation, and their names would be remembered as long as intelligent beings valued justice over oppression and love over hate. The three generals walked together from the assembly hall, and they had found purpose in their pain and meaning in their loss, and they knew that their wives would be proud of what had been built from the ashes of war. And as they looked up at the stars, they could almost hear familiar voices whispering that the galaxy was finally free, and that the future belonged to those who chose hope over fear and unity over division. The war had begun with the murder of three innocent women, but it had ended with the birth of a new civilization based on the principles they had lived and died for, and their legacy would endure as long as beings remembered that freedom was not free, but required constant vigilance, and that love was not weakness, but the source of the greatest strength.